Hello and welcome to Rosie's Rise. Welcome to Rosie's Rise. Here at Rosie's Rise, I like to share techniques specific to sourdough bread baking, along with some bonus information, if you're lucky and if I'm in the mood. Today we are going to be talking about how to knead our sourdough bread. In particular, we're focusing on the no-knead technique of folding our sourdough dough. With a wet dough or sourdough, you will find that the traditional kneading technique of working it out on your bench can get very messy, very sticky, and not so fun. So with sourdough, we tend to use a folding technique, or otherwise known as no-knead technique. Whichever one you want, it's the same thing, does the same thing, so let's get to it. Folding technique is used for high hydration or sourdough breads. A high hydration would be considered anything that's 70% baker's percentage of water and above. I normally work with 75% to 78%, not quite hitting that 80%, and I have yet to do an 85+% baker's percentage of water. That's definitely considered the very elite pro bakers of the sourdough community. One day. Kneading, folding, whichever technique you use, they're both important for the same reasons. By folding or kneading your bread, you're redistributing the sugars, the foods that the yeast and bacteria need for fermentation. You're also redistributing the yeast cells and the bacteria, again, important for fermentation. You're keeping the temperature even throughout the whole dough, so you're not really having hot spots or areas of high fermentation activity and in areas where there's little to none. Of course, the main reason for folding or kneading your dough is that gluten strengthening and development. You're aligning the gluten strands, you're strengthening them, you're developing them. The reason with sourdough, you don't actually have to physically knead your bread and, labor over it 10 to 20 minutes is because we are working with a relatively high hydration dough. Now, if we look at the science of gluten formation, we know that gluten forms when water interacts with two enzymes found in flour. The two enzymes I'm referring to are glutenin and gliadin. A little bit of a science lesson right there. You're welcome. When water and glutenin and gliadin mix together, which they do when you mix the dough, gluten starts to develop. So obviously when you have more water in your dough, you'll have far more interactions and far more gluten. For this reason, you don't actually have to knead as you would normally do with your more traditional breads. This is artisan bread, darling. This is different, okay? The folding technique takes place around 20 to 30 minutes after the initial mix of the dough. When we first mix our dough, we do want to give it that resting period before we work with it. In that resting period, we're allowing the water and the two enzymes to meet each other, to connect, to fall in love. It's a process, darling. Once that happens, then we can start folding our dough. Grab the dough from underneath, stretch it up until you start to feel resistance from that dough, and then fold it back over on top. Give your container, your bowl, whatever you're using, a quarter of a turn, and then do the exact same thing. You'll do about 4 to 5 turns. Sometimes I do a bit more if I feel I can work the dough a bit more. In that first hour, after mixing the dough, we want to do 4 turns every 20 minutes. That math does work out. After that initial hour, you can then start to do 4 folds, once, twice every hour. When your dough starts to double in size, which for me, I have an 8 to 12 hour fermentation resting period. In that time, I start to reduce the number of folds, and I reach a stage where I've become far more gentle in handling my dough because you can feel there's a lot of air in there. It's active, it's bubbling, it's looking amazing. We've worked a lot to get to that stage. We don't want to ruin it by pushing that air out. And there you go, the folding no knead sourdough bread technique. Well, any type of bread really, but you will find it's much easier to do with your wetter dough. It's probably a much better alternative than your traditional kneading. If you're using a lower hydration dough, it's probably best to stick to that, that workout on the bench. Stretchy, stretchy, stretch. Thanks for watching today's video. If you learned something new, give it a like. If you want to keep learning about sourdough, subscribe. And if you want to learn about that resting stage that we talked about before we started folding, check out last week's video. Orderlize, 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 orderlizing. Is it a verb? Is it a noun? Find out right here. This was Rosie's Rise, putting the rise in your sourdough.